May 21st, 2025. The Oval Office turns into a pressure cooker. What started as a diplomatic visit spiraled into a fiery face-off between two powerful leaders. Accusations flew, tensions erupted, and the world watched as Trump confronted Ramaphosa with explosive claims about South Africa's land crisis. But was it truth or political theater? What followed shook international diplomacy. Stay with us as we uncover the full story behind this high-stakes clash. The world watched. Now so will you. To understand today's firestorm, we must rewind to 1994, the year apartheid formally ended, but land inequality did not. Nearly 90% of South Africa's land was still in the hands of the white minority, descendants of colonial settlers and Afrikaner farmers. For the black majority, promises of economic justice through land reform remained largely unfulfilled. Land was the currency of oppression in South Africa. Post-1994, transferring that land back equitably became a necessity and a political minefield. In early 2025, President Cyril Ramaphosa signed the Expropriation Without Compensation Act into law, igniting hope and outrage. The law empowered the government to reclaim unused or underutilized land without payment, especially from absentee owners or those holding historically acquired farmland. Ramaphosa positioned the law not as revenge, but as redress, a moral and economic imperative to correct centuries of dispossession. "We are not seizing land from anyone," he declared. "We are restoring dignity." But the world, particularly the West, was split. Was this long overdue justice, or the beginning of a dangerous unraveling? Then came the flashpoint. Donald Trump, armed with a dossier of hand-picked headlines and a controversial video reel, accused South Africa of committing white genocide. In his words, they're being slaughtered for being white and owning land. The story had already been circulating on fringe platforms, but now it had the backing of a former US president. Trump's claims were bolstered by his decision to grant asylum to 59 white South African farmers, citing targeted racial persecution. Ramaphosa emphasized that crime knows no color, and in reality, farm attacks are part of a broader crime wave that affects all South Africans. Experts point out that black farm workers are often victims too, and rural violence is tied more to socioeconomic conditions than race. Trump took a complex, emotionally charged issue and distilled it into a dangerous, oversimplified narrative. That narrative found eager ears among far-right circles globally, and when Ramaphosa pushed back, it wasn't just about defending South Africa's dignity. It was about preventing the world from believing a narrative that could fuel real-world violence. So is there a genocide happening in South Africa? The facts say no. But in the age of virality, perception often races ahead of truth, and this perception is reshaping global politics. The flames of controversy weren't lit in the Oval Office. They had been smoldering for years in echo chambers and airwaves. A significant catalyst behind Trump's narrative of a white farmer genocide was the media, particularly segments aired on Fox News and similar right-wing platforms. These programs often focused on isolated farm attacks, framing them as racially motivated and widespread. While farm-related crime in South Africa is a reality, these portrayals exaggerated the racial element and overlooked broader social dynamics. Nuance was lost in favor of a narrative that fed into pre-existing fears about land seizures, reverse racism, and anti-white violence. One of the most influential forces behind this framing was AfriForum, a South African lobby group that represents the interests of Afrikaner minorities. Over the years, AfriForum has made numerous visits to Washington, briefing US lawmakers and conservative media on the alleged systematic targeting of white farmers. They produced documentaries, submitted crime data, and published glossy reports that were later quoted in American media without critical scrutiny. AfriForum's campaign was strategic, emotional, and visually powerful, and it worked. Trump and many others saw South Africa not as a country wrestling with inequality, but as a ticking time bomb of racial retribution. The result? A deeply polarized public. Inside South Africa, many black citizens viewed Trump's remarks as both ignorant and insulting, another example of Western leaders defending white interests, while ignoring the historical context of apartheid and colonialism. Meanwhile, some white South Africans felt vindicated, finally seen by a global power. Internationally, reactions were equally divided. Human rights groups condemned the genocide claims as dangerous misinformation, while far-right commentators in Europe and the US rallied behind Trump. What emerged wasn't consensus, but chaos, fueled by selective storytelling and amplified by a media landscape increasingly driven by outrage. What happened inside the Oval Office had consequences far beyond its walls. Within 48 hours of the Trump-Ramaphosa confrontation, the White House issued an executive order suspending over $900 million in U.S. financial aid to South Africa. The justification? Concerns over human rights violations and land confiscations targeting ethnic minorities. Critics saw the move as a blatant misuse of power, punishing a nation based on politicized misinformation. But Trump stood firm, telling reporters, "We won't fund regimes that trample on property rights and target people based on skin color." The fallout didn't stop there. In an unprecedented diplomatic escalation, the U.S. expelled South Africa's ambassador to Washington, Ibrahim Rasool. Rasool, a seasoned diplomat and former anti-apartheid activist, was reportedly blindsided. South Africa responded in kind by recalling its own ambassador from Washington, issuing a formal protest note and labeling the U.S. move as colonial posturing disguised as moral outrage. This diplomatic chill spilled over into global forums. At the G20 summit in Osaka, the atmosphere between the two nations was icy. When President Ramaphosa took the stage to address global inequality, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio walked out in protest, an act that stunned many and symbolized just how far the rift had widened. Behind closed doors, U.S. officials lobbied allies to take a harder stance on South Africa's land reform, while South Africa turned to China and Russia for support, raising fears of a geopolitical realignment. What began as a disagreement over media narratives had snowballed into a full-blown diplomatic crisis. The damage went beyond aid or summits. It struck at the heart of South Africa's post-apartheid identity and exposed the fragility of international diplomacy in the age of populism and propaganda. For millions watching around the world, the message was clear. In this new era, facts alone don't drive foreign policy. Perception does. The fallout from the Trump-Ramaphosa clash didn't just echo through diplomatic channels. It reverberated powerfully within South Africa's borders, igniting debates that cut across party lines, racial identities, and economic interests. The African National Congress, ANC, Ramaphosa's ruling party, stood firmly behind the president. Following the contentious Oval Office meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and South African President Cyril Ramaphosa on May 21, 2025, the Economic Freedom Fighters, EFF, issued a strong condemnation of the proceedings. The EFF labeled the meeting as imperialist theater, asserting that it aimed to vilify EFF leader Julius Malema and undermine South Africa's constitutional democracy. Malema also criticized President Ramaphosa's visit to the U.S., suggesting that it compromised South Africa's sovereignty and was poorly timed amidst domestic challenges. But it wasn't just politicians speaking out. South Africans themselves were divided. In urban centers like Johannesburg and Cape Town, some citizens expressed cautious support for land reform, but bristled at Trump's intervention. In rural provinces, especially in areas where farm attacks have occurred, white communities voiced fear and frustration. Some felt abandoned by their government, while others admitted that Trump's spotlight only intensified tensions on the ground. Economically, the situation grew more precarious. Foreign investment in South African agriculture dipped, with several European companies suspending operations pending political stability. The rand weakened, and economists warned that U.S. aid cuts and political uncertainty could trigger long-term damage to food security and investor confidence. The result was a country looking inward, wrestling with a century-old wound now exposed on the global stage. Reports indicate that even within South Africa, the narrative of a targeted campaign against white farmers is contested. According to an article by the Associated Press, white Afrikaner farmers themselves have rejected the notion of a white genocide, acknowledging that while rural crime is a serious issue, it affects both black and white individuals. The article notes that South African statistics show 12 murders occurred on farms in 2024, with only one victim being a farmer, suggesting that the broader violent crime rate predominantly impacts poor black citizens. In a world dominated by viral headlines and political theatrics, the Trump-Ramaphosa encounter serves as a chilling reminder. Simplified stories can cause real-world damage. The narrative of white genocide in South Africa, though dramatic and emotionally charged, is not supported by data or independent human rights analysis. But the power of that narrative, fueled by biased media, lobbying, and political opportunism, proves strong enough to fracture international alliances, endanger lives, and shift the course of policy. South Africa's journey with land reform is neither perfect nor simple. It is a high-stakes balancing act, delivering justice for the historically oppressed without igniting new cycles of inequality or violence. Mistakes may be made, frustration may grow, but it remains a domestic issue, best navigated by the people of South Africa, not hijacked by foreign agendas. Looking forward, U.S.-South Africa relations will require more than just diplomacy. They'll require mutual understanding, an acknowledgement of history's weight, and a commitment to truth over convenience. Ultimately, this controversy teaches us something deeper about the modern world. Leaders can shape perception, but it is up to citizens, journalists, and institutions to demand clarity over chaos. In the end, a lie repeated loudly enough becomes a global crisis. But truth, though quieter, endures.